Today on the Missions Podcast, are faulty practices among missionaries opening the door for dangerous syncretism? We'll explore that topic in just a moment. But first, a message from ABWE President Paul Davis.
ABWE missionaries are coming beside the lost and the hurting around the world. And through the Global Gospel Fund, they're pulling people from the darkness and training them as leaders. They're planting churches, and they're even beginning their own missions movements. You may already support one ABWE missionary. Would you consider a gift to the Global Gospel Fund to support all 1,000 of our missionaries? Thank you for that.
Become a partner today at abwe.org/Global Gospel Fund. Welcome to the Missions Podcast, the show that explores your hard questions on missions, theology, and practice to help goers think and thinkers go. I'm Alex Kochman, Director of Advancement and Communications. I almost forgot my own job title there. Joined as always by Scott Dunford, West Coast Advancement Coordinator for ABWE International. Scott is on the West Coast. Those of you who listen regularly know he's soaking up his rays right now, his vitamin D, getting all that in. And I'm over here in Pennsylvania. We just got slammed. And I am looking at the mother of all, what's it called? It's not a stalactite. Why is my brain stuck on that? Icicles. Icicle. There we go. The mother of all icicles is hanging basically right over my head, right behind me. If this was video, you could see, but this one is like 20 feet long. I'm not exaggerating. If this fell on you, it would impale you. It would kill you. That's what we've got going on in Pennsylvania here. Scott, I imagine you're not jealous.
No, I'm not. It's surprisingly sunny, although native Californians would not be happy about that because they know that means fires in the summertime. So we need rain. You can keep praying for rain here in California. But yeah, it's a sunny day. And those of someone like me who's grew up in the Midwest and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan is used to cloudy winters. I do not complain about the sun. So that's good.
Yeah, God is good. The sun's still shining. And hey, listeners, we don't want to presume upon you. We don't want to assume that you like what you're listening to already, but we're just going to go for it. And if you like what you hear or you think you're going to like this episode, let's just assume you're going to like it. Go ahead and share it from now. Share it from now. Leave us a 5-star review and a positive rating if you haven't done so in whatever your favorite podcast app, especially iTunes. That helps the big tech overlords. That helps us stay in their good graces. At least we believe it does. I don't understand all the algorithms, but I'm told that helps us. And at the very least, it does kind of get this in front of people that are also going to resonate with it. People that care about theology and missions and bridging the gap between those two different disciplines, those two different topics of conversation. That's what we're going to do today, Scott. And, as we talk about the task of a missionary, is taking the gospel into people groups that don't yet know the one true and living God. Okay. Sometimes we use the term missions very broadly. Everybody's supposed to live missionally, to do the work of an evangelist, all those things. But today we're going to work with that technical definition here of cross-cultural mission, because we've got to deal with what happens when the gospel goes into a pagan or idolatrous or polytheistic, non-Christian religious context. And some crazy things can happen there. Let me throw something out at you, Scott. Okay, so let's say you're in a Hindu context and you're evangelizing, you're preaching the gospel. At what point do you see not just conversion happening and baptism, people responding to the gospel, but then the change that comes from that, throwing away the idols, right? All of the hundreds and hundreds of idols that would be worshipped in a context like that. Does that all happen all at once? Does that happen with time? This is the perennial kind of topic of contextualization and just the messiness of discipleship that we're always coming back to on the show. It creates a lot of questions for me. I'm sure it does for you too. It's, theologically, it's one thing, but, practically on the ground, I think we can all at least agree that it does get messy sometimes.
Yeah. If we were to say, what constitutes someone becoming a believer, we could say a lot of things. We would say repenting of sin, faith in Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior, a commitment to follow him and obey the commands of Scripture, even though, we realize that's a process of growth. We would say baptism in connection to the local church. We would, and a desire to reproduce, spiritually. And and we could say all of those things, but then you break it down into like real stories, and what happens when you've got a minor who accepts Christ from a Muslim or Hindu context, and the parents forbid that person from being baptized. Are they still a Christian? We're like, well, yeah, sure. What about someone in a home that still has an idol, a shelf full of idols, or like the Chinese context from years and years ago with Matteo Ricci, and the Jesuits of like, can someone still venerate their ancestors and still be a Christian? That was a question that was wrestled with, in the Middle Ages by the popes and by, the Jesuits, sharing the gospel, or spreading, at least Catholic version of Christianity in China. Those are questions that are kind of out there, right? And we realize when it comes down to real people, things get messy.
Yeah, and the word surrounding all of this is syncretism, right? The mixing of non-Christian, pagan religious elements with Christianity. And, church history is littered with souls and bodies, that have fallen prey to this. Whether it's in Latin America and seeing the way historically Jesuit and Roman Catholic missionaries coming in there, that was fused with voodoo and with tribal religion and to the point of taking, tribal deities or demigods and replacing some of them with saints. And some of that is still reflected in contemporary voodoo practice. I know that's something you and I, Scott, have watched and seen. And there's that one Vice documentary. We won't get into all of that right now, but, there's some low-hanging fruit and examples like that. But I do want to throw out there as well. We did frame this question before the intro as this: are faulty practices among missionaries opening the door for that kind of syncretism? That's where we want to start. But you're right. This isn't a new problem. This isn't something that just started because of a certain methodology that missionaries have adopted. My mind goes back to 2 Kings chapter 5 when Elisha heals Naaman, the captain, the commander of the army of Syria. And what happens after Naaman is converted? He says, hey, I believe in Yahweh now, but I'm going to go worship, my God. Is it Dagon? No, it's Rimmon. But will Yahweh basically let me slide this one time? Because I still kind of have to go with my master to worship the God Rimmon. So like even in Old Testament times where, you're not going to get any stronger document, about the exclusivity of the one true creator, God Yahweh. Even in the Old Testament, you have this case that creates questions of like, what is going on here? Like, is that okay for Naaman to do that? Or is this, a negative thing? And without even touching that, we want to talk about, today, how do we deal with those things as well? And Scott, you happened across a helpful article in this direction.
Yeah, and I think missionaries, especially missionary leaders, but also pastors, should be engaged with what's going on in the area of missiology. And one of the resources that's out there for pastors and missionaries and others is the Evangelical Missions Quarterly. It was a separate thing, and recently it was taken over by a group called Missio Nexus, which is a big collection and kind of an ongoing conversation amongst mission agencies. Also, obviously some journals from the seminaries deal with missions topics. Certainly like the Midwestern Journal of Theology, they deal with that. But also the Evangelical Missiological Society. But I think people should be reading these articles to even know what discussions are going on. And in March of 2021, so this is the January-March issue, it's the newest issue of Evangelical Missions Quarterly, Michael T. Cooper, posted a really helpful and very interesting article out of his study. And his original study was called Ephesiology, the study of the Ephesian movement, in which he's taking a look at church planting movements. He's taking a look at the data that's coming out of these organizations that are certainly using these church planting movement tools.
Yeah,
and
just
that,
to hop in, we're talking about CPM, church planting movements, as a technical term referring to that methodology, right? So this is what we've discussed on the show before: DMM, CPM.
And in a little bit, we'll even get into some of his definitions, which I think could be helpful. But he starts out. So it's out of some research that he did in a work that he did called Ephesiology, the study of the Ephesian movement. And you can find that at William Carey Press. And I have not read it yet. I just read the article, but I'm looking forward to checking it out more. And maybe one day we'll have Michael on the show. He starts out with this really interesting discussion. It's he posted like an interview of him and an Indian pastor who's using church planting movement tools to see people led to the Lord. And he's asking him the question of like, are you encountering false teaching in the churches? And the discussion kind of goes on, points out some things that we would all would kind of expect. But then he brings up the question of syncretism, and the pastor kind of says, well, it's just a cultural thing. And so they kind of dive into that. And the question comes up in this discussion. Well, what about idols? What is the process for a new believer to throw at idols? Because as we know in Hindu worship, idols figure prominently, and there is a real spiritual power that's associated with idols, and a real connection that is believed to be there with idols. And his answer was kind of interesting, and in that he does not see that as a first step for believers, and kind of brings up some really interesting discussions. The first thing is for a believer to repent and follow Jesus, repenting from sin, but not necessarily repenting from idolatry, and brings up some of the issues of, there's a cultural aspect to this in which you maybe live in a family. And I can't necessarily imagine in my home, but if Alex, your mom and your dad, and they had a whole house full of idols, and you get saved, are you to be like Gideon and go knock them all down, or do you have to live in that setting and realize like over time things happen? So he kind of brings up this question and kind of teases it out of like, what is that process, and is there really a gap between someone making a decision to follow Jesus and in salvation, and they truly becoming a disciple of Jesus, and how does that correlate with churches, or with churches being planted?
And Michael, the author, is not trying to skate around like the massive, like blinking red, flashing red alert, danger here, sort of, underside of this issue, right? So like, he's not squishing out on us, equivocating on the idea of syncretism. So in this article, Michael, in this conversation with Rajneesh, the Indian pastor, the author, Michael, points out, he says to him, and he's kind of like trying to drop us in the conversation. He says, it's very interesting that Paul, and I'm reading now, Paul is primarily concerned with allegiance to God, which meant the immediate change from worshiping idols to worshiping the one true God. Repentance from sins came as a result of worshiping God, as new believers understood what it meant to be a disciple. So the author himself is getting at something huge there, which is that I think you see this phrase in, I believe it's 1 Thessalonians 1, but the phrase is used that they turn from idols to the living God, right? It's one action. To repent is to make a 180 turn, and you're turning not just on sin in some sort of generic sense, like, well, I'm turning away from, hating others and unforgiveness and disobedience. No, I'm turning from all sin, which is idolatry, and I'm turning to the one true and living God and embracing Christ by faith in that action, in that, that metanoia, that about face turn that happens, in tandem with conversion of the heart. There's the change of heart that precedes that, but it results in this. And, the author gets at that. And so, I think that the challenge here is seeing where this Indian pastor is coming from and pointing out some very, helpful things about like, well, maybe in our culture, like these are the tensions that a new convert might feel, and we disciple them differently. But the Indian pastor is using CPM in a way here where they're sort of allowing their new converts basically through Bible study to arrive on their own at the conclusion that idolatry and syncretism are wrong. Yeah. And I'm not misrepresenting him. That's basically how the author represents it as well. And the question becomes like, can we allow that? Is that, is is this Christianity 101, or is that like a 300 or 400 level class? It's like, all right, you've been walking with the Lord for a while now. Now it's time to throw away that little Ganesh statuette on your mantle.
Mm-hmm. Well, and not to get too nerdy about the actual article, but he kind of starts framing the question through two studies that were released. He doesn't name the organizations that released them, but they're organizations that use the CPM methods. And for those of you who don't even know what that is, like the 4 Fields training for trainers, discovery Bible study, 7 commands of Christ. These are very common and very widely used. And I'm not necessarily criticizing them, other than he's just pointing them out, that these are the organizations that use them. This is the data they released. And he basically shows, kind of like a flat, slight increase where there's professions of faith and disciples made. And clearly the professions of faith are higher. Disciples made is much lower, and the churches planted is almost, it's almost flat line. Another organization, a little higher rate of conversions, professions of faith, a much lower rate of disciples made, and almost no churches planted. And really asking that question of like, shouldn't we in movement see more of a J curve? Like he posts actually the COVID, like how it kind of went from nothing to all of a sudden, boom, straight up. And that's kind of what you would expect to see in a movement, and compared it to what, historians kind of view as the growth of the early church, which does show this like incredible J curve where it goes from very, very few believers to exponential growth over the course of, 150 years or so. And as he's wrestling through this question of like, so how do we evaluate what is disciple making, and how do we wrestle with that? He really wants to stop and say, what is the script? Can we see in Scripture any evidences of what was expected of a disciple in a context in which the gospel was growing rapidly? And before we dive into that, because I think that will be the majority of our discussion, he talks about walking in Pakistan in 1988 and seeing on a Hindu temple a picture of Jesus, and I think this would be true in Muslim context. Well, I've had conversations even just a couple of weeks ago with Muslims that were like, we love Jesus, we pray to Jesus, but the rest of the discussion was all about, like how horrible Christianity was. And he said, he came to learn that they believed in Jesus, but he was just one of the deities that were being worshiped there, and how it's easy for us, even as outsiders, to be very confused about what is actually going on in people's hearts. Like, is expressing faith in Jesus, is that all there is to it? Because what we would say about putting your faith in Jesus and what, maybe a Hindu would say about putting their faith in Jesus could have a huge gap. And so I don't know if you're ready for this, Alex, but I would say let's just dive into these 5 principles that he talks about and kind of discuss those.
Well, let's dive into that. Let's just get a couple things out of the way. We'll take our break, and then we'll walk through the 5 principles, because I think the 5 principles will form the majority of the conversation. You make a great point there, though, about like there is a difference between just saying I like Jesus, or I admire Jesus, I obey his teachings, and I worship him, or even I worship him exclusively. I've got a good friend who's engaged in dialogue with and even publicly debated an Islamic leader on the West Coast. And one of the questions that he asked him was, what would you say to a Muslim that comes to you and says, like, I want to read the Injil and learn to follow Prophet Isa? The Orthodox Muslim answer to that is, I'd call him a good Muslim. He's being a good Muslim at that point, right? Like, the difference is, do you worship Jesus, and do you worship him, exclusively? I think especially going back to the Hindu context where there's polytheism involved. But one of the other questions that I don't want to gloss over, and you already kind of unpacked, this is radio, right? So we're gonna tell, not show. We can't show you, but these charts here that different organizations practicing some of these methodologies are showing, you've got one line of the number of professions of faith, and then there's a gap, and below that another line tracking disciples made, and then way at the bottom, this line that you mentioned, it's kind of flat. It's the number of churches planted. Yeah, it's certainly not the kind of J-shaped exponential growth that you would expect to see if there was truly like an explosive movement happening. But the other question is, from at least a theological standpoint, how are these different lines, right? Like if we're going to do this biblically, okay, then disciples made and professions of faith, at the end of the day, that is the same thing, is it not? If it's not the same thing, right? Like is there a distinction without a difference? If there's not a real difference at root there, what are we counting as a profession? Are we counting people who make a profession of faith, but we're not considering them disciples? And if they're not a disciple, then why are we counting that as a profession of faith, right? Like there needs to be like a holding up of the mirror to ourselves, I think, on some of these things where we just recognize that we need to preach the gospel, call people to repentance and faith in Christ, which includes lordship to all of his commands. But it also includes, conversion and change of heart, which happens with an embracing of Christ's atoning death, right? Like these things can't necessarily be like chopped up and you save this for 6 months later into the discipleship process and you save this for a year later or what have you. We have to be correct in how we count these things and trust the Holy Spirit to change hearts in a visible way. And then that bottom line of the graph, churches planted, again, like, are we intentionally winning disciples, air quotes there, without assimilating them into local churches? And I realize there is a lag effect there. Like you get, okay, you have one convert. Well, let's get, a couple more together before we call this puppy here at church, right? Like there is a lag time there, but at the same time, like let's not pursue as good or healthy, normatively, right? And that's the key thing here because things happen and it is messy, but normatively, let's not have disciples floating around without the local church. So I wanted to draw that out. Those are some critical ecclesiastical things, theological things that the author seems to agree with. And so what we do want to dive into, he gives some good guidance for people who would maybe consider themselves practitioners of these methodologies and people that wouldn't consider themselves practitioners. He says, hey, here's 5 ways that we can do this movement thing, at least in a way that's more healthy. And we want to dialogue about those, Scott. Let's take our quick break. We'll do that back in just a second, talking about syncretism.
Have you ever been approached by a student expressing a missionary call? For the last 15 years, Spurgeon College's Fusion program has been equipping students for missions through life-on-life discipleship, college coursework, and intensely practical training. If you know a student desiring to become a missionary, send them to Fusion at Spurgeon College as their next step. To learn more about how we are equipping students for a lifetime, visit spurgeoncollege.com/fusion.
Hi, I'm Scott Dunford, and I'd like to share with you about a new nonprofit ministry established to help churches, Christian schools, and other ministries protect children and prevent abuse. Rich Hamar from Church Law and Tax states that the number one reason that drives churches to court is child sexual abuse. I can't think of anything more devastating to these lives, their families, and our witness before a watching world than sexual abuse that takes place in ministry. The traumatic impact often leaves the vulnerable not wanting anything to do with God or his people. Our efforts toward evangelism, discipleship, and spiritual formation are not only neutralized, but shattered. Evangelical Counsel for Abuse Prevention was formed to help ministry leaders understand the complexities of child protection and abuse prevention. They are establishing standards and an accreditation program that will help verify that appropriate measures are in place at your church or ministry. Learn more about them. Find a helpful and free assessment tool to help you see how you measure up in this area. Go to abuseprevention.org and click on the link for this resource assessment. Evangelical Counsel for Abuse Prevention.
And this June, attend the national conference. Go to abuseprevention.org and register with ABWE21 as the promo code to receive 20% off your ticket. That's promo code ABWE21 to receive 20% off. Brooks Buser, president of Radius International.
I am here with Mark Dever, senior pastor at Capitol Hill Baptist and president of 9 Marks.
When you go to a culture that's a different language than yours, you're ending up in a kind of majority language that's been reached. And there are other peoples still more hidden, and it's those people who are often almost entirely unreached, and they take more cross-cultural effort. Is there a way we can better train people to have more realistic expectations of what life is like in the kind of 2 steps away from my culture, and be able to sustain family life with its normal difficulties there, so that there can be a long, years and even decades-long witness in that culture? And it seems like Radius is set up to provide that training. Radius is about reaching unreached people groups.
Go to radiusinternational.org. Radiusinternational.org.
We're back, the Missions Podcast today, talking about syncretism and are we causing it with some of the methodologies that we employ. So, Scott, where we left off, we're about to dive into these 5 principles here. Before we do that, let me just be that guy. Can I be that guy? Please
You
again.
are.
Yeah. Why change from normal, right? I'm always that guy. Go ahead, and if you've not yet, you know what would be cash money for the lifeblood of this show would be to leave us a positive rating and a review in Apple Podcasts or your favorite app. That would just be a blessing to us. Anyway, I've said enough. Dunford, tee it up for us.
Well, I'm going to read these 5 principles. I'll read one at a time, and because I think they're worth reading in whole. And he's trying to take these from the book of Ephesus, and certainly Ephesus is a context, a very pagan context, and we know, Diana was worshipped. There's a whole cult around that, and yet we do find Ephesus being a church that is thriving and growing, and a lot of involvement and discipleship, and very positive things. We do want to model what happened at Ephesus all over the world. That'd be wonderful. So I'm going to read the principle, and then you go ahead and respond to it, Alex, and we can discuss each one. There's 5 of them. So the first one says this: a movement can be defined as a passionate group of people whose convictions necessitate an identity which propagates a message that turns into action, resulting in social or religious change. In the New Testament, that movement resulted from mature disciples whose leaders empowered them to action, resulting in planted churches. These empowered Christ followers turned the world upside down as they multiplied and spread a message that connected to Jesus' story to the story of the peoples they engaged. Anything you find controversial about that statement?
I'm curious what you think. I mean, here's my reaction to that. So I don't have anything against that definition on its face. I think it's a good definition. I'm not zealous for a definition of movement because it's not a biblical term per se, right? Even the word missionary, I would argue that you get that from, the Greek, apostoleo, right? There's the being sent. I care even more about defining that. With movement, though, I'm not aware of that having a clear New Testament, linkage there. I think we're kind of stepping foot into a bit of sociology there and borrowing and plundering the Egyptians in that discipline to help us over here. And that's cool. I'm down with that. I don't have a problem with anything that was said. I like some keywords in there like mature disciples and planting churches. Obviously it needs to focus on real, identifiable. Look, that's a church. I see elders, I see word and sacrament, that's an identifiable, ecclesia there, right? And there's the maturity of the disciples. So I like a lot of what was said. I guess I would just kind of push back slightly and to the author, just say maybe we're starting at the wrong point here because even if we define movement a certain way, are we called to see that happen, or are we supposed to leave that to the Holy Spirit? What are we called to do normatively is kind of what I go back to. What is ordinary gospel ministry? It's preaching the gospel. It's making disciples. It's assimilating them into churches. It's training national leaders. Whether or not that, that spark catches flame in such a way as to lead to a movement, that's awesome. But is that ours to determine? I would say let's focus on what we're called to do and then leave the results to God. I would want to stipulate that first. What do you think, Scott?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not as bothered by the term. I mean, 'cause I don't even know that it's a sociological term as much as it's a missiological term of trying to say, how do we even talk about things that actually have happened? Sure. We have seen, just even the book of Acts, what do you call it when 3,000 people get saved in a day and the church goes from, very tiny number, hundreds to thousands, in a quarter, and is that something that should be repeatable? Is that really the goal? And that's what I think what you're asking that question. But we do see in some countries where it's in China, over the course of a couple hundred years, you saw the church go from a really struggling, very harassed, persecuted little group of people, very dependent on Western missionaries, to all of a sudden being, 100 million people. Like, what do you call that? And if you call that a movement, then we needed to say, okay, well, what are the elements to that? And what are the elements of it being a faithful movement and not just we've also seen rapid growth in Mormonism, we don't want to produce that. So anyway, but I think your critiques and your questions are fitting. Like, what is a true disciple? So you're saying this principle about principle 1. Principle 2, he goes on to say, in the New Testament, a Christ follower is more than someone who grows in their knowledge of God. I think that's really critical, right?
Yeah.
It is a great point. It isn't just someone who's growing in curiosity about God. And I've dealt with many people like this. They're very curious about God. They want to learn a lot about it, but they're not willing to follow him. So a Christ follower fellowships with other believers, worships in a community, and prays like those assembled in a house in Acts 4. When empowered by the Holy Spirit, a Christ follower boldly declares the word of God, and more people become followers of Jesus. This understanding of a Christ follower is highlighted throughout the New Testament and is a primary reason for the growth of the early movement in Ephesus. Now, we might quibble with all that should go into that definition of a Christ follower, but any thoughts about that principle?
Yeah, that's good. And by the way, one point on principle 1 real quick too, you mentioned China, and I want to say amen there too, but there's also like how many generations of Hudson Taylors, of people that experienced a lot slower progress, right, of doing the long-term language and cultural acquisition, preceded what we see now happening in the church in China, which is explosive growth. Right. So I think it's probably it's in our DNA as North Americans to like look at the, mature fruit and say, okay, now how can we hotwire this puppy to get there quicker, and to miss the generations that preceded that and led up to that. So that's just a, one side comment. But yeah, on this, I think this is a huge point. And the second principle, like a Christ follower is not just a seeker. I think there's theologically sound, doctrinally, conservative pastors in the U.S., in North America, in the West, who, in terms of sending missionaries, they at home we would reject, let's say the seeker sensitive model and having pyrotechnics and on stage at your church and entertaining the goats basically to hopefully draw in a few sheep along with them. Like that's kind of I think like collectively, there's more and more rejection of some very worldly sales tactics in the life of the local church. But ironically, in missions, there hasn't been the full repudiation of that yet. Because what do? We tend to define a convert, or a disciple as somebody who's still kind of on the periphery there. And I was looking for the exact reference. I can't find it. But, I think you see it throughout the book of Acts, where as the church is multiplying, growing, people are worshiping, they're feasting, they're engaging in fellowship. Every now and then you see this glimpse at the outside community, like, and everyone in the town held them in high esteem. And, but they didn't join them for fear of being, basically, disparaged by the leadership. And whether it's the Jewish leadership or whether it's being looked down in the eyes of the surrounding Greco-Roman culture. But there's that idea there in Luke's writing, in Acts rather, that there's always people interested. Right. There's always people that are curious and exploring. That doesn't a convert make. Jesus says you're for me or against me. And so like if we're going to count anything, let's count baptism, not just a profession of faith. Let's count the baptism act. And then that baptism act should also, that should be somebody joining the local church at that point there too, publicly. I think he begins to get at that.
Well, and the pressure's real. I mean, I understand, here we're on the state side of it, right? And we want to tell the story because we know that telling the story also encourages people that are giving, and it also helps motivate people to continue to go, right? And so missionaries feel that pressure, and they're working, especially working in like these really unreached people group contexts. Like it can be really hard work. I mean, I know some missionaries who've been very faithful. I've worked with them. I know their life. They're godly, they're faithful, and they're working in some of the most grueling places in the world. And they've seen 1 or 2 people saved in the course of, a dozen years of ministry. And so we really want to tell those positive stories. But, I saw this even here, in our church, a young guy. He's interested in the gospel. He's doing Bible studies, and pretty soon, like he's made a quote unquote profession. He's been to church maybe once, and so we baptized him probably prematurely and never saw him again. And he's still living with his girlfriend and still kind of teasing around the edges of Christianity, but he's also very open to some of the other pagan ideas that are floating around, California right now. So, we probably rushed too fast because he really wasn't a disciple of Jesus. He was a guy that was interested in Jesus and thought some of the teachings of Jesus were pretty cool, and liked, the guy that he was, that was witnessing to him, and our desire to see that grow caused, maybe a short circuiting of a process, in his own life that maybe hurt him. So I like the fact that he's talking about, like, there is something to this. It isn't just like a mental assent or an interest in Jesus or gathering together and hearing stories about Jesus. There is a real commitment, and it's also a commitment to gather in a community. It isn't, and that's, one of our big critiques, right, with the insider movement, is that it's not connected to the body of Christ. And that is just not a New Testament principle. Are we okay to go on to principle 3?
Yeah. Good stuff.
So principle 3 said this: the New Testament leaders understood that there was only one head of the church, Jesus Christ, Ephesians 1:22. Such an understanding leveled the leadership of the movement to such a point that Christ's followers clearly understood their responsibility of making more disciples as they were empowered to use their gifts for God's glory. These leaders understood that they worked together with others as equals in God's mission, as God had called them all to be co-laborers, 1 Corinthians 3. When Paul wrote about these leaders, their responsibility was clear. They were to equip the saints for the work of the ministry, Ephesians 4:11-12.
So my take on that is, I think this is one area where sometimes your people that want to talk a lot about movements and rapid multiplication, I think that's where that camp can sometimes be talking past the camp that would place a higher emphasis on the long-term, slow, gradual, traditional. I mean, can we call it the proclamational model, right? I think those two groups can talk past each other a little bit on this particular point, because we're all Protestants here. We're evangelical Protestants that are at this conversation, and we believe in the priesthood of all believers. We believe in equipping the saints for the work of ministry. We believe that, every individual believer has an evangelistic responsibility. They have a responsibility to be discipling people in their families, and then in their vocations, in the community as the Lord would give them availability and opportunity, all those sorts of things. And so, for me, somebody who I would resound with what's called the proclamational movement, or methodology rather. Absolutely. Individual Christ followers need to take that responsibility seriously. The Great Commission, calls for us all to be about the work of discipling the nations. Here's what I would just say, though: we can't be so radically egalitarian that we throw away all distinctions. And that's what I would just want to also hold on to, right? Like, not everyone is a missionary in the sense of being commissioned and sent by a congregation to reach a people group among whom Christ has not yet been proclaimed. Not everyone is a missionary in that sense. The same here, Paul considers them all coworkers, but the reason that that's a compliment is because it's the Apostle Paul saying that, right? Like, if Paul was just a dude in a church, then calling them co-laborers actually doesn't resonate with any particular, meaning. It's because it's the Apostle Paul saying, guys, you are co-laborers with me, an apostle of Jesus Christ. The fact that all the lay persons in the church can say, wow, that's pretty cool.
And I think it's important that we don't miss that, Paul addresses his letters, often to the elders and deacons. He talks about traveling back to the cities in which the gospel was planted and establishing elders in every church. And even that context, of Ephesians 4, but also in 1 Corinthians, there's a talking about spiritual gifts and of equipping different. Not everyone has the same gift. And certainly there's the need for spiritually mature elders to lead these churches. I think I agree with principle 3, but I also think that it's important in the missiological world and the missions world that we are emphasizing that, part of our task is to see leaders raised up who can lead others also. And I think that almost every missionary wants that. I just, anyway, just think it's important for us to keep highlighting it.
Yeah.
And then principle 4.
I mean, Scott, you're an elder, you're a pastor in your church.
Yeah.
This is not to disparage your congregation, but like, I would imagine you would not feel comfortable if your congregation, your flock, had no shepherds over it.
Well, no, I would know.
Right.
And
yeah,
but there's and there's also I think a spiritual element to this that I have not always been very mature about, and that is there's times when I don't want, especially when I wasn't a pastor, where I didn't want spiritual leadership in my life, and or I wanted it when it suited my purposes. But there's a point when we submit to godly leadership, even when we don't understand what they're doing, that can be a benefit to us, and even sometimes when they're not always right, there can be a protection for us. It's kind of like obeying our parents, right? There's times when your parents are, if you have a legalistic parent and they're saying, to your kids, you can't do this and you don't want that, and it doesn't seem right or fair, but there still can be a protection obeying. I mean, look at David obeying and following Saul, and I don't want to stretch this out too far, but there can be a protection in that God uses. And so that's what we say to young missionaries wanting to go to the field, like, get into a local church, submit to a pastor and a church body for a while, serve faithfully, and let them send you out when you're ready, Yeah. And we do hear from people who are like, well, my church doesn't have any desire to do this, and so I need to go find something else. And there's some danger there.
Yeah. Well, let's get to syncretism. I think principle 4 will tie these two things together, right? Like, who is qualified to lead, in the next generation of disciple making, and then how can we avoid what creeps in the form of syncretism?
So principle 4, he says, spiritual multiplication is a principle of exponential growth to 4 generations. Okay. In 2 Timothy 2:2, Paul represents a first generation disciple. He calls it G1, who continues to make more disciples, one of whom was Timothy, G2. In Ephesus, there were at least 8 additional named disciples of Paul's who presumably applied the same spiritual multiplication asked of Timothy. These G2 disciples, generation 2 disciples, were then expected to make more disciples, generation 3, who would in turn make even more disciples, generation 4. It should not escape us that the emphasis is in the Ephesian movement was on making disciples, not planting churches. In a very short period of time, I argue the movement in Ephesus grew to more than 5,000 believers. I'll let you go first on that.
Yeah, sure. A couple things come to mind. First, I think it would be a really interesting doctoral dissertation if somebody wants to take this up, to look at over time some of the rhetoric that we use as evangelicals talking about the early church, and overlay that with when in church history, particularly in the 19th century and following, there was an upsurge in restorationist movements. A restorationist movement is pretty much any branch or sect of Christianity that is premised on the early church had it right, we have it wrong, and in order to be faithful, we have to return to what the early church did, which there's maybe some truth in that, of course. But this is, again, where we have to be, I think, careful and know in the New Testament the difference between what is descriptive and prescriptive for us, right? So, when Paul tells Timothy in 2 Timothy 2:2, what you've heard and received, in me, pass it on to faithful men who'll be able to teach and train others likewise. That is absolutely prescriptive. Go and do that, and that's a command that applies to us today as well. What we're not supposed to do is maybe copy every aspect of the Ephesian church, right? From the standpoint of this, the Ephesian church died, right? It's cool. We know more about the Ephesian church than probably any other church in the New Testament when you consider that Timothy was the pastor there. So we have those 2 pastoral epistles. We have the book of Ephesians. which was probably a circular letter, but we think it was probably aimed mostly at Ephesus. You have Jesus' address to the church at Ephesus in the book of Revelation, and then you have what happens in the book of Acts. There's a lot going on there that you can kind of assimilate and collate that data and get a good picture of the church in Ephesus. But it did die. I forget what century it died in, but I think it was by the 2nd century, it died. And you see Paul warning the Ephesian elders in Acts 20, men are going to rise up from your own ranks, teaching destructive heresies, seeking to lead others astray. So Paul specifically says to the elders who are doing this multiplication work, if we can call it that, right? Be careful, because you're, G3, right? The third generation, like, are going to contain false teachers from this elder board. So be careful, guys. And, to look at the early church idealistically with rose-colored glasses and think, man, they were doing everything right. Well, no, guess what? They were struggling with idolatry and heresy and syncretism, the things that we struggle with today on the mission field. And on the one hand, you can say, well, when the gospel goes out, it's messy and we have to prepare for the mess. And perhaps that's true. But at the same time, Paul was very concerned for all those churches that he planted. Granted, he planted them very rapidly, and he was engaged in personal disciple making. And if you were to draw it out, maybe it would look like, I don't know, like a pyramid type thing, right? Where, you see just this generation branches off from that one. And Paul was doing disciple making, connecting with all these individuals who then went out and in turn made disciples. But he was very concerned with the growth of false teaching and in correcting that in his epistles, something that a lot of DMM and CPM practitioners aren't as concerned with right now. And I'm sorry, I'm talking a lot, but just one quick note. In the debate between our friend Chad Vegas and Missio Nexus, this article is on. So the president of Missio Nexus, Ted Essler, they did a debate on DMM and CPM a couple years ago, and the whole thing's about 2 hours long, but you can find it if you just Google it. It's worth watching. Now, some people chafe at that debate because they maybe would say it generated more heat than light. I actually, as someone that knows Chad, I can actually tell he's restraining himself a lot there. So it's kind of funny for me to watch it. But the point in my bringing that up is Chad raised this very point to Ted and said, aren't you concerned of syncretism? Aren't you concerned about false teaching coming up in some of these movements? And Ted's answer was very interesting. He said, well, no, we're not seeing that. We haven't seen it. I've traveled to this field and to that field, and we're not seeing that yet. And correctly, I think Chad pointed out, and this is not to disparage Ted, I think this is a point where the debate did generate light and not just heat. The point is not if you're seeing it now. The point is if you're seeing heresies 10 years from now, 50 years from now, 100 years from now. And that's what I don't know we always have in mind is, are we thinking about the potential for syncretism, not just in the first generation of disciples, but in the fourth, the fifth, the sixth generation? And that, I think, we've got to be asking. Let's think long term. Let's think, what is going to be the theological foundation of this church, 100 years into the future, should the Lord tarry? Scott, what do you think?
I think those are valid concerns. I've also been sometimes surprised. I've been surprised at how bad theology is amongst mature, seemingly mature older Christians. But then I've also watched this young disciple that I'm working with out here, and some of the thoughts that the Holy Spirit is bringing to her mind as she's being attacked and really facing persecution, true persecution, physical and psychological and spiritual persecution. And the questions that the answers that she's coming up with from her study of Scripture are sometimes just blow my mind. Like, what theology books are you reading? So I do think there is a right critique in saying the Holy Spirit does in fact, empower true disciples to follow Jesus and understand his word, but she's also influenced by, teachers that are helping her too. But I think that the part I like about Principle 4 is the idea that healthy, growing churches, and call them the movements if you really want to, is predicated on disciples making disciples, and it's interesting. I was watching this football coach, right, at University of Wisconsin. The defensive coordinator was talking about the principle of three, find three leaders, invest in those three leaders, and then have them invest in three. Like, I wonder where he got that from. That's exactly what Jesus did. And I think it's so much. I mean, I've seen it in many churches I've pastored and been associated with, that it's like a lot of the emphasis on discipleship and evangelism is like, pastors go do this. And the churches, though, that are really thriving are churches that have engaged their membership in reaching and discipling people. And so I do think he's right in saying, like, we need to democratize discipleship for sure. This idea of, like, I've heard pastors talk about maximum truth, meaning like all the teaching needs to come from the pulpit. I think that isn't healthy and right, and we have to equip faithful men who can teach others also. Some of those will end up being elders and deacons, but not necessarily, right? And some of the greatest evangelists, we've seen have been guys that are no names, that, the shoe cobbler that led the Moody to the Lord, and we see how effective people who are discipling that. We can all think of a Sunday school teacher that impacted our lives, or an Awana leader that impacted our lives, that is never going to be recorded in the history books, but had an impact. And so anyway, principle 4, and then principle 5, and we probably need to start wrapping this up. But he says, during Jesus' earthly ministry, he spoke about the church only twice. In Matthew 16, we have Jesus' promise that the church is his and he will build it. In Matthew 18, we learn that the church has the means to address conflict. Jesus certainly expresses ideas that have been incorporated into the ministry of the church, such as baptism, communion, evangelism, discipleship, giving, and caring for the marginalized. However, these are generally responsibilities of disciples. Outside of Matthew, the only other place where Jesus addresses the church is in the final book. To the angels of the 7 churches in Asia Minor, Jesus wrote individual letters commending some, admonishing most, and warning about the future if they do not listen to the Holy Spirit. In essence, this is Jesus' assessment of the movement in Asia Minor. In Revelation 2 and 3, we can discern several distinctives of a healthy church. It goes, but I will leave these for you to discover. Certainly, you and I would not totally agree on his limiting the comments about the church to only that time that ecclesia is used. I mean, I think it's a church letter written by a churchman, Matthew, to churches about Jesus. And I think all these references to the kingdom and are all for the church. So I want to be careful of that. I mean, I think that but beyond that, Alex, what are your thoughts about that principle 5 and the impact of that?
Yeah, you took the words out of my mouth, right? Every time, and Matthew is obsessed with the kingdom. Yeah. But I think that has the church primarily in view, the church and its impact on the surrounding world. But actually, what we're saying then actually strengthens this principle, because Jesus then has a lot to say about the church, both in the Gospels and in the letters at the beginning of the book of Revelation. Basically, I think what he's saying here in a roundabout way is pointing first of all to the need for things like church discipline, because he cites Matthew 18. But basically, the instructions there for how to do church in a healthy way are in the New Testament. We have to avail ourselves of them. If syncretism is beginning to take root, if you have professing baptized believers who refuse to divulge their idols, give them up, excommunicate, right? Like call to repent, hold them accountable, right? Those are those keys of the kingdom are given to the church, and I think it's a shame that we don't think of those as being available to us and available to missionaries who are planting churches that, it's messy and you're trying to get everybody in the door. But man, I mean, look what happens in the book of Acts. Yeah, you have explosive growth. You also have Simon Magus and Peter saying like, your money perish with you. And you have Ananias and Sapphira being struck dead. Basically, you have, some severe kind of statements from the Holy Spirit of saying, here's who's in and here's who's out. And pastors, missionaries, church planners to guard the flock by indicating that, exercising the keys of the kingdom. And sometimes that involves church discipline. I think all of that is in view here. So let's apply what this gives us as far as marching orders for the church. Right.
And, it's interesting. The majority of the letters that are written to churches. You have Philemon and you have the letters even written to Timothy and Titus are still written very much with the church in mind, and very churchy letters. And so, I think it's important for missionaries to remember. And I love that this article calls us to that, even from a CPM perspective, and that is the church in mind and what kind of churches are we planting. And that goes all the way down to how we evangelize and how we make those disciples, how we see them incorporated into communities. And, we have to keep that in mind. And so when we're growing, we recognize the growth will be slow. We recognize that, unfortunately, if we really are wanting to report glossy numbers, that it's not going to be the exciting thing to talk about the difficulty of discipling and losing, people who are following Jesus and falling away, and those that are remaining through persecution. But this is the stuff that sticks. And anyway, I'm very thankful for this article. I hope people will go out and check it out. Or go ahead and go right on to William Carey Publishing and pick up Ephesiology, the study of the Ephesian movement. I think it's definitely worth reading. And thank you to Michael Cooper, who I don't know if he'll hear this or even know we talked about it. We'll try to tag him if we can find him. A lot of missiologists are kind of hidden away and engaged in gospel work and don't even want their stuff known. But check it out, and thank you for listening.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if somebody knows Michael Cooper, share that with him. We're grateful for the article. Good conversation starter. And thank you. We're grateful for you as well. Thanks for listening. To get more content on missions and theology and practice, go to missionspodcast.com. Make sure, again, we mentioned it earlier in the show, but share, leave a review, and thank you for doing that. It helps us get this content in front of other people. If you have a question or a comment, alex@missionspodcast.com. Until next week, thank you for listening.